Good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world, of course. In my part, it's afternoon now. Uh, my name is Bas Rodenburg. I'm professor of animal welfare at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And I'm also, together with Beerte, joint editor-in-chief of Animal Welfare, the UFAW journal. I have two announcements because some questions have been coming in on the link to the recordings. This is posted in the abstract book, so you can find the link to the recordings in the abstract book. And the same is true for the link to the voting system for the posters. So if you look for either of those links, please check the abstract book. So we're now starting session 5 of this conference. And in this session, we have 3 longer presentations and 5 short talks. We look very much forward to all those presentations. The first presentation is our second keynote speaker of this UFAW conference, and that is Eva Read, and she will talk to us about what is animal welfare.
Welcome everyone. Today I'll be talking to you about the definition of animal welfare within animal welfare science. What I want you to take away from my talk is firstly that there is huge variation among the field on how animal welfare is defined, and secondly that this is a problem. Many different definitions in use at one time isn't how we should be dealing with the concept at the heart of this field, and there are both scientific and ethical reasons for this. So I introduce myself first. I started my further education in the animal behaviour and welfare programme at the University of Plymouth, and then just a few months ago, some years later, I finished my PhD, which was in the philosophy department at the LSE at the Foundation of Animal Sentience Project. And my thesis was titled Rethinking the Foundations of Animal Welfare Science. And the foundations that I focused on were A, welfare, the object of the science's study, and B, the reason for its study. So what is welfare science here for? What does it look like when it's had a good year? And broadly speaking, what does it aim to do? So welfare science has historically been left alone, really to do its stuff without much attention from philosophy, and I hope that this is starting to change. Welfare science has a tricky landscape to navigate of historical obligations to various human stakeholders and a heavy influence and power of the animal industries, as well as a complex and nebulous object of study about which people have different intuitions. But part of the duty of the body of animal welfare experts is to make sense of these different intuitions and provide wider society with a representation of our best current knowledge about what is plausibly in the interests of other animals. And welfare science has to do this because it has the position in society of the accepted source of knowledge on the interests and ethical treatment of other animals with whom we interact, and its judgments on welfare have influence on animal policy. And currently, its judgments on welfare are variable and difficult to pin down. So, as an undergrad, when I was trying to learn from welfare science about what we should treat animal well-being as, I found it quite striking that there was pretty much unregulated use of a bunch of different definitions of welfare that all implied slightly different things. Some core ways of defining welfare here. So we have welfare as being characterized as mental and physical health. Then we have welfare as subjective experiences, so just the mental part. Then from Dawkins, we have a rejection of characterizing welfare in terms of this mental part, instead defining it in terms of whether an animal is healthy and have what they want, with wanting being construed as a non-conscious motivational state. Then we have David Fraser's union of theories view, where we have to respect that some people value biological functioning, some people value subjective experiences, and some people value the naturalness of existence, and we have to characterize welfare in those terms accordingly to pay due service to these different views. And then we have Donald Broom's definition of welfare in terms of allostatic load, so welfare as the ability of an animal to cope with their environment. And I was seeing these different definitions given across the literature, given in teaching by various professors, and given in conferences, for example, like this one, without reference to there being a debate at all. Rather, people were picking their favourite definition and stating that as a fact and moving on. But at the same time, we have these claims of agreement or objectivity as well, which is so interesting given what we're trying to define. And these claims seemed unfounded. So I had my sense that we need some data on this actually, and so one of the first things that I did in my PhD was to design a survey to send out to current animal welfare researchers, and I did this with the help of Andrew Crump, an animal welfare biologist, and Jonathan Birch, my supervisor, the director of the Animal Sentience Project, and a behavioural scientist at the LSE, Ganga Sridhar. And we invited every first, last, and corresponding author on any paper published between 2019 and 2021, inclusive, in 4 top animal welfare journals. And we had a response rate of 22%, which was about what I was expecting actually after I had loosely followed this paper survey and cognition researchers, which had for my methodology, and this paper had a response rate of 21.6%. So I have presented the bulk of the survey results at the Welfare Assessment at Farm Level conference in Florence last September. Much of the survey was to do with the demographics of the field. Researchers reported aims and priorities and problems and solutions for the discipline, given my other question of interest in my thesis. But this is the first time I've presented the results from the definition section of the survey, where we asked 3 questions. We asked, what is your preferred definition of animal welfare? This was a free text question, as the thing that I was interested in was the variation among the fields, so I didn't want to constrain the respondents in their responses. Then we asked, what should a definition of animal welfare do? Here we gave 4 options in a pick and rank question: capturing what animals value, being scientifically measurable, capturing what either the industry or the public mean by animal welfare. And this is because these are all raised as differentially important for the concept in the literature on the subject. And then we asked, how confident are you that your preferred definition satisfies those functions that you laid out? And this was a Likert scale question ranging from extremely uncertain at 0 to extremely confident at 7. And it's useful, I think, to present these latter 2 first, just to orient ourselves. So our respondents overwhelmingly reported capturing what animals value as the most important requirement on a definition of animal welfare, followed by requiring that this characterization of what animals value is to some extent scientifically measurable. And these are considered to be significantly more important than capturing what non-expert stakeholders mean when they talk about welfare. And this lends a really nice weight to the often cited core aim of welfare science, which is to understand welfare. So we shouldn't be taking understanding welfare to simply mean understanding how welfare as construed by some other people changes under certain interventions, so the applied side of welfare science. But instead we should take it to mean reflecting our best knowledge about what a good life is for other animals. So what we're really trying to explain by well-being, and what we're really trying to maximize in our attempts to understand animal welfare, is our ability to understand what a good life is for other animals, what is plausibly in their prudential interests. And we're also trying to explain it in a way that makes it amenable to scientific inquiry. This is where interaction between welfare science and philosophy can be really fruitful for an emerging multidisciplinary field of animal welfare research, combining sciences and the humanities. And yeah, so there's a Vessier and Forkman paper, I think from 2018, that says that because we can't define welfare scientifically, we have to define it societally. So we have to be responsive to the interests, to what society thinks is relevant for welfare. But these results indicate that there's a sentiment that this isn't endorsed by the field. And one takeaway is that instead of looking to society, we can look to and work with philosophy instead to make progress on this question of what animals value. And for the second graph, with a reasonable but not overwhelming confidence, respondents reported that their definition sort of satisfies the functions that they required in this graph. On the left, so the sense is that the definitions that our respondents gave go a fair amount of the way to characterize the interests of other animals, but just not all the way. So what were their responses? I found even more variation here than I was expecting. I didn't have the confidence. I didn't have any confidence that welfare researchers all agree on anything necessarily, but I was taken aback by the variation in the results. So I was able to categorize just over half of the responses according to prominent definitions in the literature. Mental and physical health was by far the most popular, even though it still doesn't make a quarter of the responses. A good 15% endorsed welfare in terms of coping. 13% endorsed welfare as valent subjective experiences or feelings only. Then around 7% we had for Fraser's union of theories, and what I thought was a surprisingly low 2% for welfare in terms of whether an animal is healthy and has what they want. And then 25% of responses were definitions that were more unique to the respondents and often enriched with additional constituents of welfare. So, for example, we have welfare in terms of naturalness primarily, in terms of being to do with one's life having meaning, or the expression of one's agency, or being minimally interfered with by humans, or being safe. I will be putting this data online for open access for everyone to look at, hopefully soon, because I think it's really interesting. And there's minutiae of variation that took me aback and that I think would be instructive, perhaps for the field to be aware of. So, for example, the naturalness definition at the top, this is an adaptation of Fraser's union of theories that puts naturalness as the most important requirement of all three. And then at the same time, we have World Animal Protection also adapting Fraser's union of theories, but putting the mental states as the most important of all three. So you can really we can really see instances of different definitions being pulled in multiple different ways by different researchers or advocacy groups. And then a second example of how interesting this data set is the bottom definition. So to say that safety is important for welfare, this is really radical. It expands welfare out from the common understanding of welfare as the state of the animal at this moment in time view that doesn't consider any potential futures, into thinking about welfare actually as to somewhat dependent on one's future, which has implications for premature death by killing, in fact being a welfare harm, which I'll return to at the end of this talk. But this comes without any attention to an animal's feelings, which makes it a really interesting combination view, in my opinion. Then we had 7% of respondents giving welfare assessment frameworks as definitions instead of their associated definitions. 1.5% for the 5 domains assessment model, which is a framework to assess welfare that depends on the hedonic view of well-being, so welfare as valenced feelings. And then 2% of respondents giving the 5 freedoms definition, and another assessment framework as a definition, which comes from the Bramble report, which defined welfare in terms of mental and physical health. And then another 2.6% of respondents giving the 5 freedoms, but plus positive experiences. And then 9% of respondents did something totally different, not defining welfare as something of an animal at all, instead defining it in terms of an epistemic project, like, for example, any discipline that is looking to improve the knowledge, understanding, and welfare of animals, a practical project, so, for example, treatment of animals in a humane manner that can be enforceable and measurable, or an ethical project, for example, concern for other animals. Now, I'm very proud of the survey in general, and I'm grateful for this glimpse into the mind of welfare researchers, because it tells us, resoundingly so, that there is huge disagreement and unclarity from the field at the moment about what welfare is, and I would characterize it as an extensive motley collection of definitions used and endorsed by the research body. For those researchers who thought that any debates about welfare were in the past, this is news enough really to take note of, but the situation isn't just newsworthy, it's also a real problem. So I have said that welfare experts should be able to make sense of our best knowledge about what animals might require for a good life by the lights of the reports from welfare researchers, but also for an in-principle reason about what it means to have expertise about animal welfare. So disagreement among the field is an in-principle problem because it's not conducive to expertise on animal welfare as a collective field. But also it's a consequential problem leading to real negative effects on the lives of animals, because disagreement within the field legitimizes the cherry picking of minimal definitions of welfare by those who have vested interests in doing so. And usually this is to engineer a narrative where an intuitively harmful welfare practice is construed to not be so. So I have a couple of examples. Firstly, scientists have used a lack of consensus to stop a proposed ban on the battery cage. They created doubt about welfare harm, and then they created hope for good welfare under a minimal understanding. And this case is detailed by historian of science, Sam Dockerant. So a proposed ban on battery cages in 1979 was dropped after poultry welfare experts cited the lack of consensus on welfare as a reason for why they couldn't be sure that welfare was in fact poor in battery cages. Then they argued that if they saw welfare as adaptation to one's environment and worked to breed hens to adapt to the battery cage, then hen welfare in the future would be good in the battery cage. This report led to the proposed ban being dropped, and battery cages then weren't banned in Europe until 1999. And the US pig industry has used the lack of consensus in the literature to create doubt about welfare harm in sow stalls to justify their continued use. This case is detailed by Fraser. So gestation crates for pigs, sow stalls, were banned in Europe following an EU Scientific Committee recommendation in 1997 under an understanding of welfare as effective states and natural living and biological health. But this review paper, Barnett et al. From a group of Australian researchers, defined welfare as physiological health, and they disagreed, saying that sow stalls can meet the welfare requirements of pigs. They say that public perceptions may result in difficulties with the concept of confinement housing, but the issue of public perception should not be confused with welfare. And this is one of two reviews that has been used by the pig industry to argue that because there is no scientific consensus that gestation crates harm cell welfare, there's no scientific basis for banning them. And sow stalls are now only starting to be banned in the US, with California's Proposition 12 banning products that come from animals in severe confinement, being the first instance of this. So disagreement and permissibility about the definition of welfare has been used to continue practices harmful to welfare under any reasonable account. And there's always going to be pressure from the industry for us to see welfare in a minimal way, compatible with the industry's needs. And internal disagreement about welfare makes the field vulnerable to this pressure. But there are other emerging new pressures that we should also be mindful of. One is the pressure from new, flashy, or otherwise interesting markers. So developers have interests in overclaiming their ability to assess welfare as a whole. I experienced this optimism in conversation at a UFAW conference, in fact, in Edinburgh a few years ago, where I was excitedly told by a computer scientist that the development of Fitbits for cows represented the first time the objective assessment of animal welfare. And we want to be robust against this type of claim. The second is the pressure from loud proponents of particular partisan theories about the good life. So to the extent that people do think that pretty much everyone agrees that welfare is to do with pleasure and pains only, as was reported in one of the quotes I gave earlier, but also is something that I had heard from my colleagues for a long time. This is likely down to proponents of this view being so loud. So animal ethics in the West has really been dominated by a view of animal interests as only to do with their experience, pleasures, and pains. And this is the underlying view of effective altruism, for example. Its associated organizations represent much of the animal movement now, at least in the US and the UK, as far as I'm aware. And they have lots of money, and they fund research, and they advise policymakers. And this is brilliant because they're so invested in and efficient in making moves to improve the lives of other animals. But just as we shouldn't look to the industry for a definition of welfare, we shouldn't look either to proponents of particular views. So effective altruism is done against a backdrop of welfare as pleasures and pains only, which is a partisan particular view of well-being, and it misses out things that are relevant for welfare according to other top theories of well-being, but also according to the received wisdom of the field, of this field, as I have just shown. And I'm wrapping up here, mindful of giving a lot of time for questions. And I just want to emphasize that what I've wanted to convey in this talk is that expertise on animal welfare in animal welfare science means making sense of welfare given different partisan views, not simply reflecting these partisan views, and not by collective adherence to one either. I want to emphasize that from the survey results, we know that there's broad agreement that welfare includes conscious experience, but we also find a broad dismissal of welfare only including conscious experience. So researchers tend towards pluralism about welfare, with it being comprised of multiple constituents, and the disagreement is about which constituents there are. And a tend towards pluralism, the picking and choosing of one's own definition, which we saw so much of in the responses, and a general feeling that most definitions don't manage quite to fully capture welfare in its complexity, means that there is an appetite in the field for a unifying, pluralistic, rich definition of welfare that does manage to capture all that seems to be important. And this is something that we should embrace. So we should embrace the effort to move towards the field rallying behind one rich definition that can unify people with different intuitions, because the aim isn't to reflect the differences in society and the theories by adhering to my particular claim of a thin view of what's important, but to reflect the collective wisdom in the theories and in the science as well. This is how we understand welfare. We understand the plausible ways in which it is understood. It's like a meta understanding of some sorts. And on this, I'm finishing with a warning. That's something that the field will have to take seriously if it's serious about being led by knowledge on the interests of other animals and not by the constraints or beliefs of other members of society, is that premature death is plausibly a welfare harm. The understanding of death not being a welfare harm seems to be one particularly effective way that the practice of owning and killing animals has historically distorted the concept of welfare into something thin, so that we can claim compatibility of killing young animals with them nonetheless having good or acceptable welfare, and this influence remains today. So death not being a welfare harm is often claimed to be objectively true. So much so that, as in this paper, the graph I have up here, killing an animal can come out as being less harmful to their welfare than scaring them with a loud noise. And this model, the Sharp and Saunders model that they're using, is claimed to be an objective way of characterizing welfare harms. And their claim is that, look, if this doesn't seem right to you, then that's just, you have to swallow this difficult pill. The objective truth about welfare is unintuitive to you because you mistakenly think that death is relevant here. And this paper has been cited by multiple animal welfare papers that concur, saying that the public might think that an animal is harmed by death, but the objective truth is that they're not. But death is a welfare harm under many reasonable accounts, just not those found in welfare science. So a premature death may harm an animal by frustrating their future directed goals, which implicates all animals with mental time travel to the extent that they can have future directed goals. Or a premature death may harm an animal by ridding them of their potential for positive future experiences, or by frustrating a fundamental interest of theirs to reach their developmental potential. And both of these latter positions both implicate all sentient animals as being harmed by a premature death. So this is an area of historical agreement, in fact, among the field about something that, if it wants to take welfare seriously as a reflection of animal interests, and if it wants not to be derailed from this by vested interests, we should look to move on from. And with that, I will finish. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to the funders of the Animal Sentience Project, and thank you to UFAW. I look forward to seeing you now for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eva, for that presentation. And you're here live. That's very good.
Hi.
Yeah, so let me start with a question, as people might still be entering their questions. Yeah, very, very stimulating and interesting talk. I was wondering, in the Netherlands, we now have a process where we use sort of a modified version of the 5 domains model and also the quality of life concept to rethink animal production, and also to push the industry to move towards higher welfare systems, cage-free, calf with cow concepts, etc. Is that something that also fits in your thinking about sort of an overall useful framework? Can you comment on it?
Yeah, so obviously the 5 domains is particularly popular, and my theoretical reason for wanting something slightly different is that it is dependent on a hedonic view of welfare. So anything that does, and this is like sort of like, in most situations it's an inconsequential problem, because the inference is that things that happen objectively to the animal just have effects on subjective states. But there are some instances where we might want to say that, well, just because the animal is feeling well and is in a good situation in captivity, because again, the 5 domains model is useful for assessing welfare in captivity, but it because it's generated from that captive environment, it might be missing out like possibilities about the inability of certain captive environments to be conducive to a good life of an animal looked at objectively without trying to fit their welfare into the captive environment. So like I think it's useful in its situation, but if we're looking for a definition of what welfare probably is, then I wouldn't want to go with the 5 domains because of its basis in the captive environment and its adherence to one theory of welfare.
Yeah. You also talked about animal agency in your talk, and that's indeed a topic that I also find there's common ground between animal welfare scientists and philosophers or ethicists, and indeed then it also starts to stretch, like ending an animal's life. Would an animal, of course, if an animal would have their own choice, probably they would they would not choose to go to the slaughterhouse at some point, for instance. That sounds a bit. But so that widens the scope probably of the concept that welfare scientists are usually working with.
And I think that's because I see potential in animal welfare science because of how it's used. Like it's used, it's looked to by the public, for example, to comment on whether an animal's life is good enough or whatever, and like to tell us what animals care about and what makes their life go well. So it's not so it has this sort of role in society as being expected to be able to tell us what the good life is. And so there's this like theoretical side to welfare science that maybe should be developed a little bit more, which is grappling with difficult problems about what might be in their interest that might actually just come into conflict with what we're using them for. And that's okay, like we can do the applied stuff as well, like we can use different models for assessing welfare that don't have to talk about welfare as brilliant welfare. But also, like we have talked about for a while, welfare being variable on a scale from bad to good. And lots of the definitions at the moment that we have at our hands don't easily push us right into positive welfare, which is why we have, for example, the new paper from the Cost Lift Action Group defining positive welfare. But what we want is to be able to define welfare as something that's not just, we don't want to keep these concepts separate of like minimal welfare that we'll use for when we're talking to farmers, and then positive welfare, and not have a way of integrating them into one concept that genuinely does show us how it varies from flourishing to failing.
Yeah. And how do you look at, sometimes I get a bit frustrated with, we can debate and discuss, I think, forever about welfare concepts, welfare definitions, and then as you showed, there's a wide range, there's different words being used, people may not even understand each other always, what they mean exactly. Does that not have the risk in it that we might miss out on starting improving welfare in the field? I sometimes feel that we even sort of the low-hanging fruit, the easy steps that we can take, that are not really happening, and in the meantime we are developing more and more elaborate concepts of animal welfare.
Well, no. I think like broadly welfare's, much of it is quite intuitive, right? Like we don't need any new concepts of welfare to identify many of the clear welfare harms, or to advise on what would be better for other animals. This is more, I think, something that the field is lacking is deep theoretical training on the concept of welfare, and really like you're having a science on someone's well-being. I mean, well-being is the topic for the humanities and the sciences. It's very difficult, it's theoretical, there are lots of implications for policy, and if we're training animal welfare scientists without purely in the science, if we're dancing around the concept of welfare just so that we can do our applied stuff without wasting our time on thinking about what a good life might be, then you worry that the welfare experts aren't welfare experts. And there's just potential, I see no reason why the field would be limited in such a way that it couldn't handle theorizing about welfare and teaching it, and also doing the practical stuff.
Great. So you see that it can be hand in hand and happening at the same time.
Yeah, and it should be. I think it should be for it to be effective. Yeah.
For some reason, I don't see new questions popping up in the questions tab. That could be my technical settings.
It's quite a lot, Baz. You might
I
just
only
need
see
to.
my own questions at the moment. So
Okay, go out and just click on the question box again.
yeah, nothing changes. Could you or Birte maybe ask an extra question, because I don't see any other questions.
Yeah, there's been there's a few that have come through that are sort of fairly consistent. One of them is, so with all of this, what do you see as your definition of animal welfare? So you've said that you want a rich definition and the rest. So have you come to a conclusion? Because clearly it's very difficult and you have those different views. So what are your recommendations? What should we be using?
Right. Yeah, you've got me. No, the last chapter of my thesis was trying to develop such a definition. I didn't want to try and shove it into this talk, partly because I'm still thinking about it, and partly just because it's two different talks, really. But it draws on a political philosopher, Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach. So she wrote a book a couple of years ago, Justice for Animals, and she recommends the application of her capabilities approach, which is an objectivist definition, framework for thinking about about welfare. The application of it to animals, and it, it talks about stuff like, this is. I don't want to go. I don't really want to go into it actually. But her suggestion, I don't think, is right for welfare science. So I don't think it's. I don't think it makes sense enough when you look at it to see why all of the things she's picked out as relevant are. I don't think it treats subjective experiences as variable as they are. There's like a bunch of theoretical reasons why I don't think that it's useful, and I define welfare in terms of holistic self-maintenance, and it's got five different parts. Look out for something that I publish a preprint of, I think, soon, rather than trying to define it here. That doesn't bode well, does it, for the unifying ability of this definition? But I promise, so it makes quite a lot of sense, I think, to me, and I find it quite satisfying. I just haven't quite finished explaining it well.
There's another question, Eva. How do you view the intersections or contrasts between the animal welfare and animal ethics, animal rights fields? And how do you see those two fields evolving in the future?
Animal rights as like one position on animal ethics, right? How do I view, what was the question? The relationship? The proper relationship?
The intersections or the contrasts, or the similarities and the differences maybe between the two fields?
I think that possibly they've been overstated. So my understanding is that welfare science still operates with, don't want to, like, this isn't trying to be rude, but quite an old-fashioned view of the roles of values in science, which is where we just conduct our science and there's no place for ethics or values. And we've seen today, and on Animal Welfare Science LinkedIn, that this is starting to change. So we're starting to understand that, like, you can do something with your science politically, and you can be driven by ethics and still nonetheless be an objective scientist. This is true in animal welfare because we are applied, so we're aimed to improve anyway, but also welfare is to do with values. Like, you have to evaluate it. You can't define it scientifically, so they're necessarily intertwined. But also, I think the difference between, I think one of the things that holds welfare science back from advocating is this feeling that they aren't allowed to make a value judgment. But the thing is, like, you can say, for example, that farming is incompatible with welfare, with acceptable welfare on welfare grounds, and you don't really have to do much. Like, that's not an animal rights view. I think like you can you can claim things on welfare grounds, that people are hesitant to claim in case that makes them seem like they are of an animal rights position or they're doing something unjustifiable. But in actual fact, it's just part and parcel of what makes you a welfare expert, in my opinion. So that's how I see it.
Thanks very much. I think that's all we have time for now, but you can find probably more questions in the questions tab. I don't see them at the moment, but it's probably just my connection. Thanks very much, Eva.
Thank you everyone.
Our next presentation will be by Kacper Libera from Utrecht University, and he will talk on detecting wing fractures and dislocations in broiler chickens.
Hi, hello everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Kacper Libera. I'm a PhD candidate working at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. At the same time, I'm also a resident of European College of Veterinary Public Health. And today, it's my great pleasure to give you a talk on one of the AI projects that I'm involved in. Let's start with some background information. The name of my project is Utopia, and in this research we are trying to combine imaging with some machine learning AI algorithms to support decision making in food industry. And to be more specific, we mean mainly food inspection, and in my part of the project we are dealing with poultry meat, so primarily working with chicken carcasses. We scan the chicken carcasses, collect a lot of information, train some models to detect some abnormalities, and then take some individualized action if needed. So I think not everyone is aware that in all European slaughterhouses in EU, every single carcass needs to be checked by an official veterinarian or meat inspector. And believe it or not, but poultry processes is extremely fast, extremely effective, and there are more than 180 BPM, 180 birds per minute slaughtered, and there's even a need for more. So imagine being this human inspector. You need to practically check 3 chickens per second, which is a lot, of course. Imagine keeping the same focus level. We need to look for some contaminations, infectious problems, animal welfare issues. Yeah, it's really a difficult, challenging job. And of course, as every human, assessment, inspection is always open for interpretation and also subjectivity. So we believe that maybe some software, hardware can help support this inspection and maybe at some point even replace it. So this is the moment where our research steps in. I was saying imaging, and we are using one of the widely used types of imaging, which is called computed tomography scanning, CT in short. It's well known in medical imaging, but we try to implement it in the food production context. So this technique is based on X-rays. X-rays, they can easily penetrate different objects, and based on different attenuation with different tissues, you see different grayscale images, 3D objects. What's great about this technique is that you can also see what's inside. Without opening a carcass, for example, you can see organs, fluid, any other structures that are inside and are not visible to a human eye, but visible for X-rays and our tomography. So this is our project in one animation. All the carcasses are being scanned, and then trained algorithms can make a decision, can classify them. Okay, this one is healthy, so suitable feed for human consumption. Another ones, they have some problems, for example, hepatitis, pericarditis. They should be excluded from the human food chain. And with a single CT scan, we can collect a lot of information, not only food safety information, but also animal welfare status and some technical measurements. For example, size, shape of the carcass, that can be really useful for further processing, for example, cutting carcass into smaller pieces. But of course, we are enjoying the animal welfare conference, so let's focus on animal welfare part of our project. And in this picture, you can see there's a unique specimen. 2 wings were broken. As you can see, some hemorrhages, bruises in one of the wings, and in the second wing there is a protruding bone. So for sure, the bird was suffering before slaughter. So definitely such an example should be closely monitored in slaughterhouse because it's detrimental for animal welfare. And yeah, wing fractures, these are important animal welfare indicators. Why? Because we can measure them, and they also reflect a lot of procedure done during chicken processing. For example, human handling, loading the chickens on farm, transporting them, but also unloading them and putting them on the shackles in the slaughterhouse. And according to the literature, the prevalence is quite diverse. For example, I found out from some recent studies that it can be from some slaughterhouses less than 0.1%, reaching up to almost 6%, which is quite diverse. In every slaughterhouse, there need to be a special person, special employee, animal welfare officer, and the responsibility of this person is to check different animal welfare indicators, take action if needed. So in poultry slaughterhouse, these people are also looking at the wing fractures. And in some countries, for example, in the Netherlands, there are some extra critical limits, for example, above which catching team, farmer, or a transportation company can get a fine. Yeah, it's quite tricky because it's really difficult to determine who is the responsible person for these wing fractures, but still it's good to have some limits, try to objectively measure it. But it's also important to know that not all the observed fractures are animal welfare issues, because some of them they can happen after the slaughter, after the animal is fully bled out, so not possible to feel pain anymore. We call them post-killing fractures. These are more like technical, machinery related issues. Still important information for the food business operator, but not relevant from animal welfare point of view. Some photographs from internet. I was saying this human-animal interaction. Really difficult job to collect 10,000, 15, 20,000 on a farm, put them in a special transportation crate. Not every catching team is handling these animals with care. Sometimes they work under really high time pressure, usually at night or very, very early in the morning. So that's why sometimes they are grabbing like 3, 4, 5 chickens by legs, causing these injuries. The same goes for slaughterhouses. Again, hostile environment, high work pressure, time pressure, and sometimes they are just not handling all the chickens with a decent care. And it's more like a kind of the anecdotal story, not really a scientific evidence, but as a vet interested in food safety, every time I do some shopping or go to a restaurant, I'm also checking the quality, safety of the product that I'm buying. So in these pictures, you can see that I found in one of the supermarkets wings with broken wings, protruding bones, and also if you go to these fast food chains, every now and then you can find a broken wing, which of course is not risky. It's not a food safety issue, more like a food quality issue, but it's also small evidence that the current method of inspection is suboptimal. Let's go to materials and methods of our study. This is a study design. We collected more than 300 chicken wings from one slaughterhouse across 5 different sampling days. Then we trained a model. It's a ResNet model, and the key task for our model was to predict if a given wing is broken or not, so a binary classification problem. yeah, I was saying binary classification, but for every AI model, it's crucial who is assigning the categories. And in our study, these were 2 veterinarians with a strong food safety background. When it comes to the programming, the training part, our models were implemented in PyTorch. It's quite known deep learning framework. We trained our models in cloud using quite powerful GPUs. We also optimized the hyperparameters using Optuna, and we trained it for 10,000 epochs with early stopping on. Basically, that was our methodology. And of course, you need to test your models. That's why from the data set, we selected around 60 samples to serve as a check for our model, how good our model is performing on samples never seen before. So here you can see our model CT, the best model that we trained so far. This model reached accuracy of 98%, which is quite a high number. Also, other evaluation matrices, precision recall, AUC, that they have quite high numbers, which we consider as a satisfactory result. If you want to know more about the classification made by your model, again, test data sets, so never seen before. You can create this confusion matrix and see what type of misclassification your model did. And in our example, we noticed one sample that was misclassified, was classified as broken, but in fact it was non-broken. Of course, we investigated the sample, and it turned out that this sample was cut in a different way by a machine, and that's why our model was confused, and probably that's why it made a mistake. But for AI models, it's not only important to obtain a high performance, but it's also crucial to understand the reasoning of your model, like what was the cause of a decision made by a model. That's why we use the GradCam, which is a popular explainable AI technique, which basically highlights parts of the images that were crucial for a decision made by a model. And in this figure, you can see parts of the bone that are being highlighted in green yellowish. And of course, if you want to train a model to detect injuries, you are happy if your model is looking at the bones and joints, right? So yeah, in this example, we know that our model is looking at bones, joints. So basically, we wanted our model to focus on this part of the image. That brings me to some conclusion and a small discussion. In the end, our model reached high accuracy in detecting weak fractures based on their CT scans. It's really important for us because we believe that's the first step for the better, closer, more objective animal welfare monitoring. And in turn, it can result in raising animal welfare standards, for example, reduced prevalence of wing fractures. It's important to note that our study was kind of a proof of concept study performed outside of the slaughterhouse. So it's one of the limitations of the current study. But yeah, we have some studies planned in the future in slaughterhouses. Yeah, I think a strength of our study was that we collected data on our own. We scanned them, and we created a unique data set. Why I'm saying unique? Because yeah, it's a medical imaging technique, CT scanning, so you don't find many research done in farm animals, particularly in chickens. But of course, we have some limitations, for example, time of processing, radiological safety for people working in the slaughterhouse, cleaning, disinfections. These are still challenges that we are struggling with at the moment. But yeah, I hope and I believe that in the near future, some of these limitations might be overcome with the goal to not only increase food safety but also animal welfare of the animals being slaughtered. Our results, they have been published recently, so if you are curious, you want to know more details about this study, please check out this paper. It's an open access, so everyone can easily read it. And here I would like to thank my authors and also other people involved in this study. Their names are listed here. Some key references. I would like to thank you for your attention. And this is the last slide of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions. You can also find some QR codes here. So if you want to know more about me, my research, please scan them. And yeah, if you want to, I'm always open for a collaboration. So if you are interested, yeah, just drop me a message. I'm always open to future projects, new collaboration. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kacper, for an interesting talk. There's some questions for you coming in. Peter Nielsen is asking, she may have missed it, but how did you distinguish between pre- and post-mortem fractures?
Yeah, so thanks for this question. Indeed, in this part of the research, we only focused on the presence of fracture. But in the same paper, we also trained another model to look into bruises. So then we can easily distinguish between pre and post killing fractures. I was just presenting a small part of a bigger project. So in other words, based on CT scan, you can only determine the presence of fracture or dislocation. So you are not able to distinguish between pre and post killing fracture. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, and in your discussion and conclusion, you already talked a little bit about next steps beyond the proof of concept. Can you sketch a little bit what it would look like? Is it possible to implement a CT scanning system in a commercial slaughterhouse, for instance?
Yeah, technically it's possible, but the problem here is, of course, the cost of the investment. It's quite complex and expensive technology. We are also considering to slightly reducing the complexity and, for example, using X-ray, mobile X-ray scanner. It's also possible, I think. So yeah, it's on our agenda. We are thinking about the follow-up projects. Technically, it's possible, but again, think about investment cost, think about cleaning, disinfection, and also radiological protection, because X-rays, they are not neutral for human beings. So also it needs to be considered. But yeah, I think that the justification for the follow-up research would be that we can really objectively measure animal welfare, among others, because with one scan, you don't only collect data for animal welfare, but also for food safety, for example, pericarditis, hepatitis, and also some technical food quality related measurements like size, shape. So it might justify the costs. Yeah.
And could the CT scanner also be used sort of to improve the information that we can collect from camera-based systems that are already existing, for instance?
Yeah, I think so, because I was saying in the beginning, CT scan can see what's inside. So we have kind of a couple of specimens where the fracture was inside of a wing. So with camera you cannot really spot the difference. But if you scan it, you see that actually the bone is broken. So yeah, I would say you got some extra information.
And can you say something about Stephen Wickens asking about the costs of the CT scanner? Do you have an idea of that? Is that already feasible to implement something like that in practice, or?
Yeah, at the end of this article, that was also a question from one of the reviewers. We were asked these questions, and yeah, of course, we know the prices. It's quite expensive. So, for example, starting from 100,000 US dollars, that's like the starting price. Of course, in the industrial setting, sometimes you need to adjust other machinery. So yeah, starting from $100,000, that's the price of the CT scanner. Yeah.
Yeah,
but then, of course, you can imagine that at some point maybe these scanners, these systems with AI running under the hood can replace human inspectors. So maybe you can then also reduce the cost of the labor. So might be also a kind of also makes sense from the economical point of view. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And then in the case of broiler chickens, all the birds will pass through the slaughterhouse. So that will
Yeah,
provide
that's our
opportunity
ideal
yeah,
setup. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Kacper. I think we have to move on.
Thanks, my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So our next presentation will be by Andrew Vowles from the University of Southampton, and he will speak on environmental enrichment as a confounding variable in applied fish behaviour research.
Hello. Hello, my name is Andrew Vowles. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the International Centre for Ecohydraulics Research, which is based at the University of Southampton in the UK. And today I'm going to talk to you about a recent study that I conducted, which was funded by UFAW, which considers environmental enrichment in the husbandry environment as a potentially confounding variable in applied fish behavioural research. So globally, millions of fish are used annually for scientific purposes. In Europe, for example, they are now consistently reported as being the second most frequently utilised taxa. There are a number of reasons for their popularity. For me, unfortunately, it's due to the poor conservation status of many freshwater fish populations, which means they're often a priority group for research into things like environmental change and management, mitigation, conservation, that kind of research. This research is needed to try and bend the curve on this downward trend that we've been seeing in global freshwater fish populations over recent decades. You can see that illustrated in this figure here, which is taken from a 2024 Living Planet Index report. What it's showing is quite a staggering 81% decline in freshwater fish abundance between 1970 and the year 2020. Now, there are numerous factors contributing to these declines, but river infrastructure is considered to be one of the major causes. So the construction of things like dams and low head weirs, which you can see in this image here. The reason for this is because it can fragment rivers, so it can block and impede fish movements between often critical life stage specific habitat. Now, the impacts of river infrastructure on fish movement and migration has been known for a very long time, and as you might expect, trying to mitigate these impacts has also been the focus of decades of research, both in the field but also lab-based research. This lab-based research often centres around trying to quantify the ability of fish to pass different model infrastructure and studying quantifying aspects of their behaviour whilst they do so. And some of this body of research is just illustrated in these screen grabs of recent publications. Now, the conditions under which these laboratory fish are held can have an influence over their welfare, and there are numerous aspects of the husbandry environment that we need to take into consideration, but physical environmental enrichment, so here I'm really talking about the addition of things like substrates and objects to add physical complexity to the husbandry environment, is one aspect that I think is often really poorly reported and also quite haphazardly provided. What this means is that we often don't know what kind of environmental enrichment, if any, has been provided to the fish that we use in this kind of research, and the haphazard nature of its provision means it's likely to be quite variable between and potentially within lab groups. But physical environmental enrichment can have a range of welfare related benefits. Many of these are listed here, and a lot of those have been reviewed in this 2016 review paper in Fish and Fisheries. But physical environmental enrichment can also impact various aspects of fish behaviour, and there's some really nice examples of this in the fish welfare literature, impacting behaviour when in the husbandry environment, but also when placed into novel environments. And this led me to think about whether physical environmental enrichment could be acting as a confounding variable within the context of the type of applied behavioural research that I conduct. So a variable we're not particularly interested in within the context of the questions that we're investigating or studying, but one which could be having some unknown influence over our results. And that led me to the study that I'm going to talk to you about today, which was to investigate the interplay between preferred physical environmental enrichment, welfare, and the behaviour of fish during an applied fish passage study, using brown trout as the model. So there were 3 objectives, and I'll talk through each of these in a bit more detail in just a second in terms of the methodology and some key results. But the first objective was to see whether the fish that I was working with showed a preference for some common types of physical environmental enrichment. The second objective was to the husbandry phase, where the fish were held under these different levels of environmental enrichment for a few months prior to the start of the final objective, which was to test their fish passage performance as they attempted to pass an experimental weir and compare performance between fish that were held under the different husbandry regimes. So if we consider the first objective, this was using a fairly standard preference test type methodology that's reported in the literature. This is a kind of conceptual drawing of the preference test tank. This is actually what the preference test tank looked like. So these fish had a choice between a barren zone, a zone containing or enriched just with substrate, a zone enriched with shelter, or a zone enriched with substrate and shelter. So individual fish were added to a preference tank. There were 4 kind of replicate preference tanks. After 24 hours, or just before the end of the first 24 hours, they were fed in this central kind of neutral zone, and then their behaviour was recorded for another 24 hours. I did 40 replicates, so 40 preference tests with individual fish. I've analysed 15 of these replicates to date, specifically in terms of the zone that they were occupying every 5 minutes. And what we can see from this first chunk of data is that it suggests that the barren zone is the least preferred, so this purple box plot here, and the most enriched zone, so the zone containing substrate and shelter, was the most preferred. And some post-hoc tests on this subset of data does also suggest that there may be a general preference for zones with shelter emerging. The second objective was the husbandry phase, so the fish were then randomly allocated to a husbandry tank containing these different levels of environmental enrichment. We have multiple kind of replicate tanks per enrichment type, and they were maintained under these conditions for 60 days prior to the third objective commencing, which was the fish pass test. During this husbandry phase, various behavioural indicators, I suppose, of their welfare were assessed. The most kind of comprehensive way in which we attempted to do this was through a novel object test. So about halfway through the husbandry phase, we ran this novel object test. So individual fish were added to a separate test tank. They were given 20 minutes to settle. Their baseline behaviour was then video recorded for 20 minutes. Then a novel object, which was a pink plastic toy, was added to one of the end zones of this test tank, and their behaviour was recorded for another 20 minutes. We video recorded all of this and have automatically tracked the movements of fish relative to the novel object so that we can quantify various aspects of their behaviour. But the rationale behind this was that fish that spend less time frozen, for example, on encountering the novel object, or spend more time closer to the novel object, are exhibiting less fearful or anxiety-like behaviours, and therefore could be an indicator that they're in a more positive welfare state. I've just finished doing this tracking, and this is a plot of the type of data that I will get from this. So we've got, this is on the y-axis, the proportion of time spent stationary or frozen. All of the data points to the left of this vertical dashed line in the middle here is our baseline behaviour. All of the data points to the right of that vertical dashed line are our response to novel object. So the novel object was added at the point of that dashed line. And what we can see is, at least over the first 10 minutes or so, is that there appears to be a bit of a difference between these dark purple points and the other points. These dark purple points are from fish that had been held under barren conditions. My challenge now is to properly statistically analyse this and delve into the data a bit more, and then obviously provide some interpretation within the context of what this might mean for their welfare. Finally, after a few months of living under our different husbandry conditions, it was time for the fish passage experiment. This was conducted in an open channel flume, which you can see in this photograph here. It's quite a common piece of equipment for running these types of experiment. It's basically a rectangular cross-sectioned flowing channel where you can add certain model infrastructure or different fish pass designs to try and improve passage over barriers to their movement or migration. In the diagram that you can see, the sort of schematic you can see on the left here, this is just a plan view of my experimental flume setup. So we installed an undershot weir, which is just essentially a board that was placed perpendicular to the flow. And at the bottom of the weir, there was just a gap between the bottom of the weir and the base of the flume. So the undershot weir just blocked, impeded, impounded the flow, and it forced water underneath it, creating a zone, an area of high water velocity, which is what you can see in this interpolation map here, red being the areas of high water velocity. So it's quite, undershot weirs are kind of like a sluice, quite a common bit of river infrastructure, but it's creating a hydrodynamic condition, those areas of high water velocity that are quite characteristic at river infrastructure, a hydrodynamic condition that often makes this kind of infrastructure difficult, challenging for fish to pass. 1 meter downstream of the weir was a mesh gate that I could raise and lower, and then 50 centimeters below that was a downstream screen. So individual fish were placed between the mesh gate and the downstream screen. This was kind of our start area. They were given 20 minutes to kind of settle and adjust to the flume conditions. Then that mesh gate was raised and they were given 60 minutes to try and pass the weir. We video recorded their behaviour whilst doing so, and we were looking at things like the number of fish that entered our experimental area, so left this start area by moving through the mesh gate, the number of fish that approached to within a certain distance of the weir, and obviously the number of fish that ultimately was successful in passing the weir. And that's what you'll be able to see in this series of figures here. So this is the cumulative proportion of fish that entered our experimental area, so left that that start area. And what you can kind of see is that there's almost a bit of a clustering between these two greeny lines, and then also a separate cluster between the purple and the blue lines. So the two greeny lines are showing data from fish that had been held under husbandry conditions enriched with shelter. So either shelter or substrate and shelter. The purple line and the blue line are showing fish that had been held under barren and substrate only conditions. Now, one way of interpreting these figures is to look at how long it takes for a certain proportion of fish to, in this case, enter our experimental area. And we can see, for example, that 50% of the fish from husbandry environments containing shelter have entered our experimental area after around 1,000 seconds or 16 to 17 minutes. In contrast, it takes around 32 to 40 minutes respectively for that same proportion of fish to do this if they had been from our barren or substrate only treatment groups, so living under those conditions. However, you can see that actually by the end of our trial time, by the end of the hour, 3 out of the 4 treatment groups have a very similar probability of entry, and that does include fish from barren conditions. The next phase of passage is fish that approached to within a certain distance over the trial time, and again you can kind of see this clustering between the greeny coloured lines and the purple and blue. This time it does seem to result in a different ultimate proportion of fish that did approach our weir. And then finally, maybe most interestingly, the cumulative proportion of fish that successfully passed. And again, that kind of trend between the green lines being higher than the purple and blue lines kind of persists through to that final stage of successful passage. This endpoint of this final graph is essentially showing the number of fish that successfully passed, and you can present that data in maybe a bit more of a traditional way. So this is showing passage success on the y-axis. So yeah, the percent of fish that ultimately successfully passed upstream over the weir, and then the husbandry enrichment environment that the fish were living under on the x-axis. And what you can see is that in terms of absolute passage success, it was highest for fish that had been living under shelter and lowest for fish that had been living under barren husbandry conditions. Okay, so some quick conclusions from this work. So the brown trout that were tested in this study do appear to show a preference for physical environmental enrichment, particularly areas enriched with shelter. There is an assumption perhaps that the provision of physical environmental enrichment, particularly preferred environmental enrichment, translate or is maybe somewhat correlated with welfare benefit. In this study, I attempted to measure various behavioural indicators of it, but my experience is that that's quite difficult to do and interpret. In terms of fish passage performance, though, it does appear to have been influenced by the husbandry environment. It looks like we're getting higher rates of passage and overall passage success for fish that have lived under enriched, particularly environments enriched with shelter, and particularly compared to fish that have been living under barren conditions. And this does appear to somewhat correlate with their enrichment preference. Next steps are I need to do more data analysis, and I also need to do more thorough statistical analysis to see if there are actually any statistically detectable trends in some of the patterns that I've been describing to you today. Finally, I think this study will provide some quite good evidence that physical environmental enrichment in the husbandry environment could be acting as a confounding variable in applied fish behavioural research. And I think as a research community, there are some factors that we know could be influencing fish passage performance that are quite well reported in the literature. Things like water temperature, for example, that the fish are either held under or tested under. But also things like fish body length and how that differs between treatment groups, for example. But the husbandry environment and physical environmental enrichment in particular are still really poorly reported. And what I hope is that this work will help encourage people to think more carefully about the husbandry environment and also certainly report it much more thoroughly. And by doing so, we'll hopefully be able to better replicate the research that we're doing, whilst also improving the welfare of the fish that we're working with. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Nathaniel Lutevel, and I'm so excited to share insights from my master's research, which explored how Western Canadian cow-calf producers perceive and approach cattle welfare, handling, and training. The literature has consistently shown that a handler's attitude significantly influences animal welfare outcomes in livestock operations. In beef production, daily interactions between handlers and animals are not just routine. They are foundational to the animal's welfare. Handlers are not only performing physical tasks, they are constantly making decisions that affect the comfort, safety, and stress levels of the animals under their care. Their mindset, their habits, and their training shape the animal's welfare, often in ways that are not immediately visible but are deeply impactful. Furthermore, training plays a vital role not only in improving animal welfare, but also in making handlers feel safer, more confident, and more effective in their roles. I wanted to understand how Western Canadian cow-calf producers think about these connections, especially what cattle welfare means, how their handling practices influence it, and how they view training in livestock handling. I conducted 15 interviews with 17 producers, both online and in person, from Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Participants were purposefully selected to capture diversity in age, herd size, and gender, reflecting the broader population of producers in Western Canada. Each interview lasted around an hour and was transcribed verbatim and analyzed using a thematic analysis approach. 7 themes emerged, 4 related to animal welfare and 3 to cattle handling and training. First, producers had a strong understanding of animal welfare. They viewed it as a complex and generally define it as providing for and responding to animals' needs. Second, they acknowledge that both public welfare concerns and their own sense of responsibility influence their commitment to improve animal welfare practices. Third, they recognize that improving welfare can boost profitability through increasing productivity. Fourth, they emphasize that handling directly impacts animal welfare. Fifth, producers were motivated to implement low-stress handling practices. However, they acknowledge that there is a variation in implementation of these practices. Sixth, they found training valuable as it helps improve handling skills, safety during handling, and motivation to work. Last but not least, they stress that effective training must reflect real-life farm settings to be practical and applicable. Overall, producers demonstrated a solid understanding of animal welfare and its assessment. They recognized the link between handling practices and animal welfare and productivity and showed strong interest in training and adopting low-stress handling practices to improve animal welfare, worker safety, and operational performance. Special thanks to study participants and funders. This study has been published and you can access it by scanning the QR code on the screen. Thank you so much for your time.
Hello, my name is Robert Kelly, and in this short talk, I'll be presenting a summary of my research into what behaviour is important behaviour, a systematic review of differences in time activity budgets between wild and zoo-housed animals, conducted in collaboration with Dr. Marianne Freeman and Dr. Paul Rose. So, environmental stimuli can cause behavioural shifts in animals that do not reflect normal activity of wild conspecifics. Some research, predominantly in wild animals responding to human-induced rapid environmental change, indicates that some species are unable to demonstrate behavioural adaptability, thus indicating behavioural inflexibility. Conversely, some species develop normal behaviours, such as tool use to access food, indicating positive behavioural flexibility, which might have implications for the welfare of captive species. However, this has scarcely been investigated in zoo animals. So the aim of this research was to assess the behavioural flexibility in species by comparing wild and captive behaviours. So in total, 104 activity budgets were extracted and grouped by taxonomic order. Those were Artiodactyla, even-toed ungulates, Carnivora, primates, Psittaciforms, and Testudines. A total of 62 behaviours were sorted into 12 categories, including out-of-sight occurrences and those that aren't specified. In RStudio, Hedges G was used to calculate effect size because it prevents overinflation of effect sizes in small populations, which I had for groups outside of mammals. Then these were then each taxonomic order was categorized based on the effect sizes of each behavioral category. So here is a sample of the results for each taxonomic order, which helped to categorize into the subsequent level of behavioral flexibility. For reference, a negative value indicates that the behavior category was more prevalent in zoo animals, and a positive value indicates prevalence in the wild. So, a prevalence of exploratory behavior and no abnormal behavior in zoo Testudines and Artiodactyla helped me categorize them as being positively behaviorally flexible. In carnivores, some abnormal behavior was found in the zoo, but foraging and exploratory behavior were also slightly more common, so they were categorized as partially behaviorally inflexible. However, in primates and Psittaciforms, abnormal behavior was common in the zoo as well as agonism. So why could this be? Primates in Psittaciforms require carefully considered management and husbandry provisions, otherwise they might get bored easily, leading to more stereotypical behaviours. Thus, this suggests that they could be behaviourally inflexible and struggle to adapt to changing environments in the zoo. However, although some abnormal behaviour was seen in carnivores, they may adapt to captive constraints, as illustrated by the increased foraging and exploratory behaviours in the zoo. Also, literature indicates successful enrichment provision, particularly food-based, is implemented for Artiodactyla, and Testudines are equipped to adapt to changing environments through thermoregulatory responses, which might offer complete behavioural flexibility. So, in conclusion, zoo management practice should consider species-specific husbandry and enrichment provisions to promote positive behavioural welfare indicators, particularly in primates and Psittaciforms. However, clearly there is still a need to focus on collecting behavioural data across the wild and captivity, and particularly in non-mammalian species, as these are still scarce in the literature. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and please see my poster for more details.
Talk at the UFAW 2025 conference. My name is Sophia Bullock and I'll be presenting research on investigating gradual decompression as an alternative to carbon dioxide for killing laboratory rats. In 2023, rats were the third most used species in biomedical research behind mice and fish, which means there are large numbers of individuals exposed to potential welfare harms in laboratories. These animals are killed using several regulated methods. However, exposure to a rising concentration of CO2 remains the only high-throughput method listed on ASPA's Schedule 1. But for over 20 years, the use of CO2 as a method of killing has been shown to be aversive and cause pain and distress. This is an issue of high importance, as failure to recognise sources of pain and distress may not only lead to suffering on an enormous scale, but poorer scientific outcomes and non-compliance with key legislation. There is a legal, ethical and scientific duty of those who work with animals to apply the principles of the 3 Rs, and therefore the provision of a humane death remains imperative. A method called hyperbaric hypoxia via gradual decompression has been explored in mice as a humane alternative to CO2. Gradual decompression involves decreasing air pressure and the partial pressure of oxygen. While this method shows promise as a humane alternative in mice, there has been no research on its effects in rats. This experiment was a proof of principle step in exploring the effects of gradual decompression on rats. Therefore, all 36 rats were anaesthetised before decompression to protect their welfare. We examined 2 rates of decompression, 75 metres per second and 150 metres per second, and 3 different profile shapes, accelerated, gradual and linear. The animals' behaviours were analysed using recorded footage in Observer XT, and post-mortem and histopathology were also performed. Our results showed that first and foremost there was a 100% kill success rate of gradual decompression in all rats. Secondly, as these animals undergo significant pressure changes, we are particularly interested in the pathology of the eardrums after decompression and subsequent recompression. All rats in this study showed intact eardrums upon post-mortem. There are some notable differences between behaviours in rats compared to mice. For example, rats took longer until they started to gasp and until they were deemed motionless in all decompression rates and shapes, demonstrating the importance of validating specific methods for specific species. Our next steps are to use behavioural and physiological measures to determine the welfare implications of gradual decompression on conscious rats, and to use operant methodologies to examine the degree of aversion for both gradual decompression and carbon dioxide. Thank you for your attention today, and please feel free to ask me any questions.
Hello, and welcome to the Fairfish database, your free source for science-based welfare information on aquatic species in aquaculture and fisheries. Let's dive right in. Choose the aquatic species you are interested in. If you would like to know which ones we have already covered, go to the species tree to find out. The landing page is an overview for quick and easy access to main biological and environmental data about the species. Also available are reusable drawings and pictures, the global distribution by Aquamaps, and the IUCN status. The data here comes from the dossier, our in-depth review of the literature on the species, on many more criteria than you see here, in more detail and giving the references. All the information comes from the welfare check. The welfare check is our welfare assessment of aquatic species in this case, aquaculture. How well is the species if we assume the lower end of the spectrum of aquaculture facilities that we can find globally? And what is potentially possible given the best case scenario? For 10 selected criteria of topics relevant to welfare in captivity, you will find our scoring for each criterion together with a short justification of how we arrived at it, based on the literature we found. If you are an interested consumer or an NGO looking for data to do a campaign to raise awareness of welfare hazards or to take welfare up into the legal framework, this might be for you. Also, if you have a company and look for inspiration, which welfare-friendly technology to develop. For practitioners, in this case farmers, we offer a separate part in the database where we gather the conclusions drawn from the literature and present it in a non-scientific language. If you are looking for more details, for example because you are a scientist, you can find it by clicking here, complete with the references. One aim of the Fairfish database is to point to knowledge gaps and hence research topics that are worthwhile of being tackled. We recently launched a similar approach to the welfare of aquatic species caught in fisheries. Here, we look for welfare hazards and how they affect aquatic species in 10 different criteria that go along the steps of the catching process. One aim is to highlight mitigation measures proposed in the literature and promote better fishing standards. There's more to discover. We are continuously developing the Fairfish database and the website. If you have questions or if we may help you in other ways, please get in touch.
Often systematic reviews are used to inform animal welfare policy, then you want to hear what I have to say. Hello everyone, my name is Johann Liesner. I'm a medical student currently completing my master's degrees of medicine at the University of Lugano. Today, I want to share with you some insights from my research on how systematic reviews contribute to animal welfare policymaking, specifically within the European Food Safety Authority, or EFSA. Let's begin with the research background. Although systematic reviews are widely considered to be a powerful tool in improving animal welfare, their direct impact on policy decisions hasn't been studied in depth. This is where our study comes in. Our main objective was to evaluate on how often animal-focused systematic reviews are actually used in EFSA's scientific opinions on animal welfare, and whether these reviews meet established reporting standards. To do this, we performed a retrospective analysis of 151 EFSA scientific opinions published between 2004 and 2023. We focused on identifying the types of studies that were used to inform these reports. For example, literature reviews, systematic reviews, and primary research studies. We also examined the quality of reporting for those systematic reviews. To assess the quality, we looked for specific features, such as the use of at least 2 databases, predefined inclusion and exclusion criteria, a study flowchart, a risk of bias assessment, a pre-registered protocol. Now, let's take a look at the results. As shown in the first figure, literature reviews were the most common study type used in EFSA opinions. Out of the 151 documents we analyzed, 40 included a systematic review. However, if we turn to the second chart, we can clearly see that many of those systematic reviews fell short when it comes to the reporting quality. For example, only a small portion included a risk of bias assessment, and very few were based on a pre-registered protocol, both of which are essential components for reliable and transparent systematic review. To conclude, systematic reviews are commonly used already to inform animal welfare policy, which underlines their role as a valid and valuable tool fostering animal welfare and the 3R principles. Thank you for your attention.
My name is Andrew Vowles. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the International Centre for Ecohydraulics Research, which is based at the University of Southampton in the UK. And today I'm going to talk to you about a recent study that I conducted, which was funded by UFAW, which considers environmental enrichment in the husbandry environment as a potentially confounding variable in applied fish behavioural research. So globally, millions of fish are used annually for scientific purposes. In Europe, for example, they are now consistently reported as being the second most frequently utilised taxa. There are a number of reasons for their popularity. For me, unfortunately, it's due to the poor conservation status.
Thank you for that. And Benjamin, one question related to Johann's short talk. So he also mentioned sort of the EFSA methodology of doing welfare risk assessment. I was part of one of the EFSA panels, and they have this system of expert knowledge elicitation, which is a combination of literature review and expert discussions to see where the data is pointing at, and to identify specific welfare risks, like a stocking density at which a certain behavior will become more of a risk. If you talk about damaging behavior, for instance, how do you look at that type of methodology? You're still muted.
Yes, thanks, Bas. Thanks for asking. By the way, Johan has his medical exam today, so he cannot join, so that's why I'm here. Hello. So we did not consider that level of assessment. So EFSA does an overall assessment using these different methodologies, but we looked at the level of methodology used for the individual EFSA report, not how the conclusion was drawn. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. But I've been wondering, because of course, systematic reviews provide sort of a complete picture, but often also in those panels, time is limited. So you also look for sort of pragmatic solutions to still come to the best answer, given the evidence. Do you see other ways of doing this in a smart way?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So yeah, we've done many systematic reviews. I fully agree, it can take a lot of time. There is a method called rapid review, which is a less rigorous systematic review. You could call it a less rigorous systematic review, but it is not, or we are currently working on validating rapid reviews. Can we draw the same conclusions as from systematic reviews? And that would be an alternative approach, which would take much less time to conduct.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for the short talks and for answering the questions. There could be more questions in the Q&A box, and you're also probably around for the posters to answer more questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So we come to an end of session 5, and the conference continues 30 minutes past the hour, so 14:30 UK time. So 30 minutes past the hour, we start with session 6. And look forward to see you there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.